You are welcome to yet another episode of LFN What's Your Say? The leading listening show where we discuss important issues with important people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. They told you it was about justice. That it was about holding a man accountable. That it was about standing up for victims. But the deeper you look into the story behind R. Kelly's imprisonment, the clearer the real agenda becomes, and justice for victims was never the point. It was about power. It was about profit. And above all, it was about control. For years the public was bombarded with headlines, documentaries, press conferences and outrage. R. Kelly, who is considered one of the most talented and influential musicians of his generation, became a target scapegoated and demonized in a calculated campaign designed to strip him of everything he had built. But this wasn't just about public opinion. This was a well-coordinated takedown orchestrated by people who stood to gain from his downfall. Let's be honest. The machine that moved against R. Kelly didn't care about the truth. It didn't care about fairness. And it certainly didn't care about justice. What it cared about was the assets. The royalties. The publishing rights. The master recordings. The revenue streams worth millions of dollars. The smear campaign disguised as a movement for victims was only a means to an end, or call it a mechanism for manipulation. They needed society to believe that R. Kelly was a monster so they could justify locking him away, silencing him and seizing control of what he owned. That's the part they don't want you to see. And millions fell for it. Blinded by emotion and misled by sensationalism, the public was turned against R. Kelly. Criticism came fast and harsh. People who once praised his genius now mocked him, condemned him, canceled him without question and without evidence or context. But ask yourself, why would those behind the scenes go to such great lengths to tear down this man? Because R. Kelly wasn't just an artist. He was an industry unto himself. He wrote, he produced, and he performed some of the most iconic music of our time. He had a catalog that stretched decades and earned royalties across the globe. And more importantly, he had ownership. That's what made him dangerous to the system, and that's why he had to go. Those pulling the strings didn't care whether the women accusing him were telling the truth. In fact, they knew many of them weren't. But truth didn't really matter. What mattered was testimony, allegations, drama and public perception. They needed statements, no matter how exaggerated or manufactured they were, to paint a picture, to create a legal basis and to weaponize the justice system for their own gain. So what did they do? They found individuals willing to say what was needed, sometimes offering them deals such as immunity from consequence even if they told lies. And many sought public attention in exchange for damning claims. They didn't even care if timelines didn't add up, if stories changed, or if evidence was weak or non-existent. All they needed was the narrative, because the goal wasn't to uncover facts. The goal was to bury R. Kelly, and once they had secured convictions in New York and Chicago, once the headlines were secured and the damage done, they dropped the mask. You'd think if they truly believed all these victims deserved justice, they would have continued pursuing every case, right? Especially in Minnesota and the remaining Illinois charges, but no. Because those additional charges had served their purpose. The media had gotten its show. The prosecutors had gotten their victories, and the people behind it all had gotten what they really wanted. That's access to R. Kelly's assets and justification to withhold the money they owed him. Think about it. The very same prosecutors who had paraded victims in front of cameras claiming they were seeking justice, suddenly had no problem abandoning the rest of the women once they had enough to lock him up. Wasn't this supposed to be about giving every victim their day in court? Why deny them that in the end? The truth is simple. Those women weren't needed anymore. The convictions were in. The headlines had served their purpose. And so the system that claimed to protect victims turned its back on them. Because in the end, it was never about them. It was never about justice. It was about strategy against R. Kelly, and that strategy had played out exactly as intended. Kim Fox, the Cook County State's attorney, was quick to drop the charges. And she didn't even pretend to care about the message it sent. These were people who hadn't even had a chance to testify, hadn't even seen the inside of a courtroom. But to her and those who had instructed her, their usefulness had expired. Let's be clear, prosecutors don't just abandon charges unless there's a political reason, and there was. Once the narrative was locked in, once R. Kelly was buried under decades of sentencing, the risk of cross-examination, exposure of lies, or complications in court was no longer worth it. The architects of this takedown had gotten what they wanted, and they weren't about to risk it falling apart by continuing. This was never about letting truth prevail. This was about controlling the outcome, and the outcome had been achieved. Now, what's truly disturbing is the way the public was manipulated into cheering this on. People who genuinely believed they were supporting justice were actually playing into the hands of those orchestrating a financial heist. A legal takedown disguised as a moral crusade. They weren't protecting any so-called victims. They were protecting profits instead. And let's not forget, this wasn't just about silencing R. Kelly, but largely about stealing from him the royalties from his countless chart-topping hits, the licensing rights and the digital revenue. The tour revenue that never came to pass, and the masters sitting in vaults. His intellectual property became the real prize to fight for. So while the public was distracted debating guilt and innocence, others were making moves behind the scenes, cutting deals, filing lawsuits, freezing accounts, transferring ownership, and quietly dismantling the empire that R. Kelly had spent a lifetime building. That's the real story here. And so they used the courts to do what they couldn't do through contracts. They used public outrage to do what they couldn't do through negotiation. They used allegations to do what they couldn't do through business. And they didn't just want him behind bars. They wanted him completely erased. This is why we say, it was never about the victims in the first place. The same system that cried for justice never even gave some of these accusers a day in court. The same prosecutors who claimed to stand with them walked away the moment they got what they needed. What kind of justice system operates like that? It's one driven not by fairness but by agenda. And the silence that followed speaks volumes. You didn't see outrage from victim advocates when the Minnesota charges were dropped. You didn't see protests. You didn't see any marches against the DA's office because they too had served their purpose. Now that R. Kelly was locked away, no one cared anymore. It was over. The story was finished and the narrative was complete. But we won't forget. We won't forget how a man was taken down by a machine that only pretended to care about truth. How the public was manipulated. The justice system weaponized. And how the victims were used and then discarded. We won't forget how R. Kelly was turned into a villain not because of what was proven, but because of what was alleged against him. And for sure we won't forget that behind the tears, the outrage and the headlines was a cold, calculated mission to take everything he had and to ensure he would never rise again. But truth has a way of surviving even in the darkest moments. One day when the dust settles and history looks back, the world will see what really happened. They will see that this wasn't justice but exploitation. And that this wasn't accountability but broad-day extortion. They will see that this wasn't for the alleged victims but for the vultures. And that R. Kelly wasn't destroyed because he was guilty but because he was a valuable asset. Thank you for watching today's video, a production of LFN Media, giving you another perspective of issues at hand. We make it our business to keep you updated with the truth amidst the cloud of lies the media wants you to believe. It is therefore important to subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon and allow all notifications so that you don't miss out whenever we publish a new video.